You're watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV from Toronto, Ontario. This is Samia Sayed. Welcome back to the show. Coming up very shortly is an interview on human rights for the Rohingya in Bangladesh. But first, let's take a look at some headlines. Calls for action on Uyghur Genocide Recognition Day. UN Decade to End Black Discrimination. Advocates to highlight Indigenous inmates' demands. Worst drought engulfs Horn of Africa. And now the details. December 9th marks Uyghur Genocide Recognition Day. Last year on this day, the Uyghur Tribunal declared that China is committing genocide against Uyghur Muslims. The Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project issued a statement this morning calling on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to take immediate action to end human rights abuses against Uyghurs by the Chinese government. A recent report by the UN Human Rights Tribunal has highlighted that the actions of the Chinese government against the minority group may account for crimes against humanity. On November 24th, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination demanded that China release all imprisoned Uyghurs and stop ethnic and religious discrimination. The first session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent in Geneva has wrapped up. Ahmed Hussein, Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion, participated virtually in the first session that was held Monday to develop strategies to overcome racism, discrimination, and other hate crimes. Hussein says that Canada officially recognizes the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent in Canada and is committed to eradicating Black racism and discrimination. Hussein says that the UN Decade will leave a lasting impact on the well-being of Black Canadians and other communities in the country. The Communist Workers' Front will be coming together with their supporters on December 16th to demand that conditions improve inside the Pine Grove Correctional Center in Saskatchewan. The news comes after Faith Eagle, an Indigenous woman locked up in the center, is undergoing her second round of a hunger strike that began after a short break in a 9-week hunger strike that ended on November 14th when she was taken to the hospital and treated with an IV. The front will highlight Eagle's demands that include the right to self-determination of Indigenous nations, timely access to medical care, clean drinking water, and an end to abuse at the center. Poor rainfall over the past 2 years has devastated the Horn of Africa, raising fears of a famine in Somalia and plunging around 4 million Kenyans, nearly 10% of the population, into hunger. The residents of Mandera, Kenya's northeasternmost county bordering Ethiopia and Somalia, are struggling for the survival of their animals and themselves as the region continues to reel due to the worst drought in decades. Mandera is home to 1.2 million people who generally depend on their livestock and riverine farming. Mandera has lacked significant rainfall for the last 6 years. In November, the UN Population Fund launched an appeal of $113.7 million to provide relief to those affected by the drought. And that's it for the news. Now, tomorrow is International Human Rights Day. Adopted by the United Nations in 1948, the day recognizes that everyone is entitled to rights as a human being, regardless of race, color, religion, language, origin, or status. For today's segment, we are going to be talking about human rights for the Rohingya. And joining us now to tell us more is Brother Adam Carroll, UN Programs Director for Justice for All, the Burma Task Force. Welcome, Brother Adam, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Brother Adam, tell me about International Human Rights Day. What is it and why is it observed annually?
Well, this annual recognition focuses on the importance of human rights recognized by the UN General Assembly through the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I recommend all the viewers to Google this document and read it. It's very compatible with Islam and with really any faith tradition. because it's based on the dignity and potential of the human being. Unfortunately, around the world, we see that human rights continually are abused on really massive scale. But any individual abuse is tragic and unacceptable. We at Justice for All work on uh, Muslim minorities primarily around the world, such as the Uyghur in China and the Rohingya in Burma, and also scattered in various refugee host countries. Um, the uh, theme of this year's event is dignity, freedom, and justice for all. But it's not about us as an organization, but our shared values that justice is for all. Um, the stateless minorities, such as the Rohingya, and I say stateless, they shouldn't be stateless, but they've been forced into that position. Um, they are at the bottom, mistreated, displaced, sometimes massacred. And this past week, we've seen a lot of very, very troubling and shocking news about how they're being treated.
Mhm. Brother Adam, one of those recent news was on the boat crisis in the Andaman Sea. Can you share just what exactly is happening there?
Yes, though it's not 100% clear, there are at least 3 boats that have run out of fuel and food. We don't know if they've run out of water. Each have at least 150 people. One of the boats just today was picked up by a Vietnamese company. I don't know if the Vietnamese government's navy was involved also, but unfortunately, they turned over the Rohingya to the Burmese military government, which is awful. And we've seen footage of the officials boarding the boat. Uh, these poor Rohingya want to escape. Um, Now, some of the boats left from Bangladesh, and of course, they had safe haven in Cox's Bazar in those huge refugee camps. However, with no access to employment or education, very limited, with rising violence in the camps, with checkpoints and no freedom of movement, a lot of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh are feeling hopeless. And this is why they're trying to flee for greener pastures.
Mhm. Can you expand on just exactly what are the conditions in the Cox's Bazar camps where people are being forced to flee, and especially on a risky passage such as the Andaman Sea?
Yes. Well, whether they're in the refugee camps where some of the gangs are engaged in trafficking, not only human trafficking, but drugs and other things. Uh, these There are turf wars between these gangs. So the local leaders that arise within the Rohingya are often targeted. Um, the education, as I mentioned, has been for the last 5 years that they've been there extremely limited, and we've been working on this issue. We see some signs of progress, but they're not at the level that they should be. And this hurts the future of the whole Rohingya people if you don't allow the children to get educated. And then again, employment. If small businesses open shops in the camps, we see again and again that the local police just bulldoze them. I mean, what kind of repression is that? They fled repression into repression. We should say thank you to the Bangladesh government for taking them in, but the policies are terrible. And this is why we have trafficking. And this is why the US and the international community needs to do much more. I see that today that Canada has sanctioned another approximately 20 individuals in Burma because of the military coup as well as the genocide. But this incremental policy is not doing enough to give hope to the Rohingya that they will return to
Mhm.
Rakhine State, their homeland.
Mhm. And if not this incremental policy, what exactly should be done to prevent or even stop the Rohingya from risking their lives in crossing the sea?
Right. Well, instead of criminalizing the victims of trafficking, I mean, we can try to discourage them, but instead of arresting them, and who knows what's going to happen to the Rohingya that the Burmese have just arrested, uh, you know, turned over by Vietnamese, um, we should be having much tougher sanctions targeting the oil and gas sector. In the US, we just had some language passed in a big legislation called the NDAA, the Defense Appropriations Act, um, but it has been weakened so that it doesn't require targeting the oil and gas sector. We keep sending mixed signals, and it's not only US or Canada, but the whole international community, India, Russia, China continue to sell arms to the Burmese military. While they do that, they're going to hold on to power and disrupt the entire country. So, yeah, I think we've just got to do much more, as we see in the Ukraine. And again, for Human Rights Day, Tom Andrews, the special rapporteur on Burma, whom we met with in the past week, he issued a statement just comparing the international response to the Ukraine invasion to the situation, the crisis in Burma. It's not on the same level. The response needs to be, I don't know if it has to be military, but it's got to be a lot tougher.
So it has to be stronger than what it currently is. For international causes such as these, I think that it's very important to note what people living in Canada can do. You know, they've heard about what's going on right now from you, but what can they do to help alleviate the crisis or even observe International Human Rights Day?
Well, human rights protection should be part of our deen as Muslims. But whatever religion or background you come from, I think find a way to uh, integrate human rights into what you do. So if you're in finance, integrate human rights into that. If you're a media person, make sure that even finance reporting has human rights concerns, values baked in. I think it's about integration so that we don't have a separate profession that's just human rights or a separate conversation that's kind of walled off from the rest of life. It's got to be part of everything we do. Human rights protection really matters, whether it's at home with our minority populations, our indigenous community, or whether it's overseas. We're all in the same boat, so to speak.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for coming in today, Brother Adam, and telling us more about International Human Rights Day. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
Now, unfortunately, due to a low internet connection, Brother Abdullah Habib, coming in from the Cox's Bazar camp in Bangladesh, was not able to join us, but he has recorded a small segment that I would like to share with you all today.
So it's been more than 2 years that 80% of the Rohingya are surviving without earning. Uh, so beside the ration, we have several family needs. So we have to work to meet them. But people cannot find work either inside the camp or outside of the camp. And the human traffic are taking advantage of these conditions and organizing people with fake provinces to go Malaysia. So according to the close sources, there are several gangs are actively working and taking people to the Malaysia.
That's all from us today. Thank you so much for watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Until next time.